Last March, I got into college basketball, and by getting into it, I mean consumed. I had never watched basketball before. I'm more of a college football girl. No one in my family watches basketball or has ever even talked about it. But during March Madness last year, my roommate had it on, and I was hooked. I was impressed, shocked, excited, and I just kept wanting more. More games to watch, more players to see, and more rules to learn. I was obsessed. So much so that I would watch basketball at work, don't recommend. And I would watch basketball all day on Saturday to the point where I did not do my schoolwork and it got me behind. I would dream about basketball, talk basketball, ask questions about basketball. Everyone who knew me knew that I was watching basketball and I was obsessed. But there was just one small problem. The new sport love was consuming me. It was affecting my work, school, and even sleep because I would just stay up late watching it. I know this is a little silly, but we've all had things that consume us for a moment and then we snap out of it. For me, it was the end of March Madness, and I realized how silly I'd been, how much schoolwork I needed to do, and what was really important in my life. And I'm sure you can think back to a thing that consumed and in some form or fashion had a grip on you. Today, we'll be looking at Deborah and Barak in Judges 4 and 5, seeing how Israel was consumed by idolatry that led to bondage and how God saves his people in unlikely ways. So, we're going to pray real quick. Dear God, thank you for this day and thank you for your word, and that is true and that gives life. We love you so much. In Jesus' name. So, our big idea for today is that we, just like the Israelites, can be unfaithful, putting our hope and trust in idols that lead us to bondage. But God is faithful. He hears our cries and he acts using unlikely people and means to bring about that justice. So, before we dive into our story today, let's begin our time looking at the background of the book of Judges and how the Israelites got into the situation we find them in chapters 4 and 5. Scholars and historians don't know for sure who wrote the book of Judges. Some speculate that it was Samuel, and others think it was multiple people putting it all together. But this book takes place after the Israelites have made it into the promised land. Joshua has led them well, he's allotted the land, and he has commanded them to love and serve God only. We see that in Joshua 24. Joshua, the faithful servant of God and the leader of Israel, passes away, and the Israelites are commanded to complete the conquest, to drive out other nations in the promised land. We see that in Judges 1. But Israel fails to obey God, and in doing so, the cycle of apostasy begins. And I am a graph girl, so I drew a graph for us to look at real quick. So this is the cycle of apostasy we see all through the book of Judges. Here is when the Israelites are turning away from God, whether it's giving to idols, following other nations, X, Y, and Z. This is where it starts in apostasy. The Israelites go into servitude. They're captive and they're oppressed. In our story, it's the Canaanites, but throughout Judges, it's all different nations. And then we see the people cry out to God. And then God sends salvation. He sends a deliverer to redeem his people, to bring them out of captivity. And then, you guessed it, the cycle starts all over again. And we will see this throughout the entire book of Judges. The book of Judges are stories that tell of deliverers, judges, that God sends to his people to restore and redeem his people from captivity. These judges weren't what we think today when we hear the word judge, but they're more of a military leader, someone to govern, put the people back on track with the Lord. While looking at our text today, let's remember that these narratives were first taught orally, that the Israelites would have been listening, and that this isn't just a story, but it's real and it's a historical event. Before we get to our story today in Judges, we see that Israel has already had 3 judges, and Deborah being the 4th and arguably the godliest judge. As we read through the narrative, we will learn more about Deborah, the people of Israel, and our God who is faithful. So we're going to start in Judges 4, 1 through 3. Verse 1. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the people of the Lord cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. And our main point here is that the Israelites, and really us, when we are unfaithful, we're putting our hope and trust in idols that lead us to bondage. We see in verse 1 that the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Our story starts with unfaithfulness to God. The cycle of apostasy has begun yet again. We see back in Judges 3:30 that the land had rest for 80 years. God's people had been at peace, and instead of pressing on into faithfulness, they sin again. And what is God's response to their faithlessness? In verse 2, we see that the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. It's quite interesting to me how the text uses the word sold. This makes me think of Joseph when he was sold into slavery by his brothers back in Genesis. And then in verse 3, we see how terrible and powerful Sisera, the commander of the Canaan army, really is. Sisera has 900 chariots of iron and oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Iron was a super big deal back then. This is like the elite of the elite armies. Israel's lack of faithfulness led them to putting their hope in idols that led them to bondage in the hands of their enemies. It's easy for us to look back on this side of the cross and wonder why didn't they just do what God commanded them? Why were they going against what God wanted, and why are they going through this cycle yet again? But the reality is that we are just like Israel. We know God and we know his character, yet we are unfaithful at times. There was a time in my life when I acted like the people of Israel. Now, it wasn't as serious as being captive by another nation or chilling with idols, but it did have consequences. When I was in high school and I was driving, my parents had tons of rules for driving. They're very strict. And the one rule I hated the most was that I couldn't listen to music in the car. It felt like it was just crushing my soul. It was terrible. Um, but like a silly teenager, at first I obeyed the rule and I didn't listen to music in the car. And then I would just listen to music on the speaker of my phone. And then I bought an aux cord and I plugged it in and I listened to it on blast in the car. So that's where we were. I was listening to music as loud and it was the best time of my life. And then one day my dad asked me, he said, "Are you listening to music in the car?" I said, "Yes, I am." So he took the car away from me for a week and I had to ride the bus and it was terrible. I got the car back, and what did I do immediately? Started listening to music again. And my brother was with me in the car, and he loved to be the DJ. It was a very sweet time. And my dad asked my brother, "Hey, were you guys listening to music in the car?" And Anderson said yes. And so the car was taken away from me for 2 weeks. And I was blatantly disobeying my parents and kept doing it regardless of the consequences. And I know that listening to music in the car and worshiping idols aren't the same thing, but our heart posture was the same. It was disobedience. What are the things in your life that you continually come back to, even though you know that in doing that thing, you're walking in disobedience? What is the Lord asking you to obey him in? And we're going to come back to that at the end of our talk today, but just be thinking about that as we keep going in our story. Now we're going to look at Judges 4 through 16. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak the son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, "Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out to Nebulim and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zananim, which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up on Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army of Harosheth Hagoyim all the way, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. So our second point in this is that God is faithful, and he uses unlikely people and unlikely means to bring about freedom for his people. In verse 4, we finally get to meet her, Deborah. She is a prophetess, a wife of Lapidoth, and is the only female judge. Deborah is known in Israel as a wise woman, someone who has been settling disputes and giving counsel, and arguably the godliest book in Judges. That's what my study Bible said. Deborah is awesome. In verses 6 through 10, we see the partnership of Deborah and Barak. Deborah calls out Barak to lead the army of Israel to battle with Sisera, the terrible 900 chariot guy. God uses Deborah to be his mouthpiece to the people and to give instruction on how he will deliver Israel through Barak's obedience. In verse 8, Barak says, If you will go with me, I will surely go. But if you do not go with me, I will not go. Barak's response is interesting. Women didn't really go to war, to the battlefield, but here Barak is asking her for guidance and for her presence. A quick note about Barak and Deborah. This is an amazing example of men and women working together in obedience to God's plan and promises. This is a working relationship that we should strive for as brothers and sisters. Now back to the text. Deborah tells in verse 9 that the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. We see the foreshadowing of another unlikely hero. God says he will use a woman to deliver Israel. This is backwards for this time and culture. And in verse 11, we're introduced to a random man named Heber. Hold on to this information. We'll dive deeper into that story in a moment. And then through verses 12 through 16, we see God's hand intervene in the battle. All Sisera's 900 chariots are laid waste by the hand of the Lord, and Barak is crushing it, and Sisera runs away like a baby. But remember, the story isn't over. God will and does use unlikely people to bring about justice. So how many of you have read the Chronicles of Narnia? If you haven't, this is your sign to read it. They are some of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis. The books are wonderful, and they take place in a wonderful land called Narnia. And there are dwarves, fauns, animals that talk, humans, mythical creatures. There's just a lot going on. Throughout the book, Narnia is pretty much always in trouble. Now, we don't have time to go into all the plots or all the books, but I wanted to talk quickly to you about a character in 3 of the books. Reepicheep. Reepicheep is brave, just, honorable, and will always fight for what is right. We love Reepicheep. But Reepicheep is a field mouse. When we first meet him in the book Prince Caspian, it's shocking that a mouse is even a part of the king's entourage. He is the most unlikely character you would think that would accompany a king and be a part of saving Narnia multiple times. I'm not saying that women and mice are the same or have equal value, but they both are unlikely characters that bring about goodness and justice to those in danger. God uses the small and the unlikely to bring glory to himself and to free the captive. We're going to wrap up our story now in Judges 4:17 through 24. But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera, and said to him, Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk, and gave him a drink, and covered him. And he said to her, Stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, Is anyone here? Say no. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground, while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. And behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So he went to her tent, and there lay Sisera dead, with a tent peg in his temple. So on that day God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. That's wild, isn't it? Our third point for today is that God is faithful. He hears us and he acts, and that he keeps his word. Remember how a man named Heber was mentioned earlier in the story? Here's where his household comes into play. Sisera has fled the battlefield on foot. When I think about an elite commander running away from battle on foot, I kind of giggle. It's a little strange, and it must have been strange to see. In verse 18, we meet Jael, the wife of Heber. She welcomes him into the tent, she gives him milk, and she puts a blanket over him. And let's stop and remember that what Deborah prophesied in verse 9. The Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now back to the text in verse 21. Jael comes over to Sisera while he's sleeping and hammers the tent peg into his temple. Oh my goodness. This is shocking and gruesome and makes us feel uncomfortable. But we see that the Lord uses someone unlikely to bring about his plans and free his people. Verses 22 through 25 tell of Barak and his army fighting against the Canaanites and winning. God is faithful, knowing that he hears us and that he will act accordingly. God heard his people's cries in verse 3, and he takes action, and he does what he says he will do. Chapter 5 is a beautiful song that Deborah and Barak sing praising the Lord after the victory. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as he rises in his might, and the land had rest for 40 years. Our story began with Israel's unfaithfulness, but it ends with God's faithfulness. And I know it's hard to compare God's faithfulness, his attentiveness, his action to anything here on earth. But this attentive in action made me think of my little brother Anderson. We are the best of friends. He's 3 years younger than me. And when I was in college, I went through a really deep season of depression. And I would just sit on the couch and just be sad. And I would just sit there and it was sad. But my sweet brother would sit with me. He went and got Ben and Jerry's ice cream one day, and he just sat on the couch with me. He asked if I wanted to talk, and honestly, I don't remember what I said. But I remember him being there. Anderson could have let me be, but he chose to pay attention to me and act. He didn't leave me alone in my sadness, but he sat with me. And I think that is what the Lord does with us. He notices us, he hears us, he acts, and he keeps his word. And we see in Judges 4 Israel's unfaithfulness and how it leads to destruction and an endless cycle of bondage. We see that God uses the unlikely to rescue his people and to teach the Israelites. We see that our God is not one up on a mountaintop, absent-minded and carefree, but that he hears our cries, he acts, and he keeps his word. Jesus is the ultimate symbol of God's faithfulness. Through Christ, we are made right with God. When we choose to lay down our desires or life for and to Christ, we receive the best thing ever, God himself. But when we act like Israel and continually sin, we are separate from God, and we will continue in our own cycles of apostasy like the Israelites. In Judges, we see God using people like Deborah to bring his people back to himself, to remind his people of his character. But in and through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, God makes a way for a restored relationship with us. So in response to Judges 4, let's think about the sin patterns in our own lives. What would it look like to repent and to follow him in obedience and faithfulness? We see in this story that life and freedom come through and from God and his plans. What are we trusting in? A mentor of mine, Dr. Kutzer, said in his teaching on Deborah, Deborah is the hero, the judge recognized for her leadership and godliness. But in Hebrews, Barak is remembered as someone who learned to trust God. Will you choose today to break the cycle, to step into freedom and life with the one who is always faithful?